For decades, the world believed it understood Michael Jackson. It believed it understood the face, the voice, the movements, the mysteries, the headlines, the rumors, and the contradictions. It believed it had solved him. The most photographed man in modern entertainment, the most analyzed performer of the 20th century, the most discussed celebrity on earth. People thought nothing about him remained hidden. But the truth is, some of the most important parts of Michael Jackson's story were never hidden at all. They were visible. They were happening in plain sight. They were written across his skin, recorded in medical files, reflected in his body, and spoken aloud by Michael himself. The world simply chose not to listen, because sometimes the truth is too ordinary for a culture addicted to spectacle. Sometimes a medical explanation sounds less satisfying than a scandal. Sometimes a documented illness loses to a rumor, because a rumor is easier, louder, and more profitable. And in Michael Jackson's case, that is exactly what happened. Beneath the rhinestones, the stage lights, the military jackets, the interviews, the masks, the gloves, and the constant scrutiny, there was a human body under enormous pressure. A body shaped by genetics, by ancestry, by disease, by stress, by performance, and by a lifetime lived under a level of public observation that almost no other human being has ever endured. This is not the tabloid version of Michael Jackson. This is not the gossip version. This is not the cartoon version. This is the story of Michael Jackson as biology, history, and medicine describe him. A gifted man whose body was fighting battles the world turned into entertainment. And once you understand that, you start to realize something unsettling. The real mystery was never Michael Jackson. The real mystery was why the world kept refusing the truth when the truth was right in front of it. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana. He grew up in a working-class family in a small house crowded with children, discipline, religion, ambition, and tension. He was one of the Jackson children who would eventually become part of a musical phenomenon. But long before the fame became history, it was simply a household where talent and pressure lived side by side. His father, Joseph Jackson, was determined, demanding, and relentless. His mother, Catherine, was gentle, deeply religious, and nurturing. Between those two forces, Michael's childhood took shape. But childhood is almost too generous a word for what he actually experienced. By 5, he was performing. By 8, he was astonishing adults. By 10, he was recording music. And before adolescence had even fully settled into his body, the world had already begun consuming him as a product. Most people develop privately. Their awkward years happen off camera. Their changing bodies, uncertain emotions, insecurities, and confusion are hidden within the ordinary mercy of anonymity. Michael Jackson never had that protection. His growth happened in public. His mistakes happened in public. His transformation from child to global icon happened in public. And fame at that level does something strange to a person. It freezes them in the imagination of the world. Audiences fall in love with a version of you and then punish you for changing. Michael was not allowed to evolve like a normal human being. Every physical shift became a public event. Every expression was examined. Every image was compared to the last one. His face did not belong to him. It belonged to the public imagination. And once a public imagination claims ownership of a human being, it becomes deeply offended by reality. That matters because Michael Jackson's body was changing in ways that were not cosmetic trends, not acts of vanity, and not attempts to become somebody else. His body was changing because it was sick. To understand Michael Jackson, you have to understand something about the immune system. Normally, the immune system protects you. It identifies foreign threats, viruses, bacteria, infections, and attacks them. It is one of the reasons your body survives daily life without collapsing under constant biological assault. But in autoimmune disease, that system makes a catastrophic error. Instead of attacking invaders, it attacks the body itself. It identifies healthy tissue as a threat and launches the same defensive machinery against its own cells. That is what makes autoimmune disease so cruel. The body becomes confused. The defense becomes the attacker. Protection becomes damage. In Michael Jackson's case, the cells being attacked were melanocytes, the cells responsible for producing melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. When melanocytes are damaged or destroyed, the skin loses pigment. Not gradually in the way people imagine a tan fading, but in sharply contrasting areas where normal color simply disappears. The condition is called vitiligo. Vitiligo is not a rumor. It is not a theory. It is not a pop culture excuse invented after the fact. It is a recognized autoimmune disorder in which the immune system destroys pigment-producing cells in the skin. It affects millions of people worldwide. It can appear at different ages. It can spread unpredictably. It can stabilize for periods and then flare again. And for individuals with naturally darker skin, the contrast can be striking and emotionally devastating. This is what Michael Jackson said he had. This is what his doctor said he had. This is what his autopsy later confirmed. And still, for years, the public preferred the lie. In 1993, Michael Jackson sat down with Oprah Winfrey in one of the most watched television interviews in history. The public expected revelations of celebrity weirdness. They expected gossip. They expected some dramatic confession that would feed the machinery of spectacle. Instead, what they got was something much simpler and more important. A man explaining a medical condition. Michael said he had a disorder that destroyed the pigmentation of his skin. He did not dramatize it. He did not turn it into theater. He did not present himself as a mystery. He spoke plainly. He told the truth in the simplest way possible. And yet the reaction from much of the public was not empathy. It was a suspicion. Why? Because the cultural narrative around Michael Jackson had already hardened. A story was already in circulation. And once a story becomes emotionally satisfying to the public, evidence starts to feel less important than repetition. People had decided he must be changing himself deliberately. They had decided his appearance represented self-rejection. They had decided the skin condition explanation was just a cover story. It did not matter that he said it directly. It did not matter that the explanation was medically coherent. It did not matter that specialists supported it. The lie was more dramatic than the truth, so the lie survived. And that tells you something profound. Not about Michael Jackson, but about us. A person can stand in front of the world and tell the truth about their own illness, and if that truth conflicts with the story people prefer, they may still not be believed. Vitiligo is often misunderstood because people reduce it to appearance. But to the person living with it, it is not just visual. It affects identity, confidence, daily routine, and the relationship between body and world. Pigment is not only cosmetic. Melanin also helps protect skin from ultraviolet damage. When depigmented areas spread, those areas become more vulnerable to the sun. The person may burn more easily. They may need stronger protection. And when the contrast appears across the face, hands, arms, or scalp, the condition becomes very difficult to hide. Vitiligo also does not negotiate with human convenience. It does not care whether a person is private or famous. It does not care whether they are trying to tour the world, shoot music videos, or appear on magazine covers. It simply progresses according to its own biological logic. And by the 1980s, Michael Jackson was not just any patient with vitiligo. He was arguably the most visible person on Earth. The exact features being altered by disease were the same features the public obsessively watched for signs of difference. That created a brutal trap. If his skin changed visibly, people speculated. If he tried to cover the changes, people speculated. If he addressed it publicly, people doubted him. If he stayed silent, people filled the silence with invention. There was no winning version of the story for him, because the audience had already decided that the truth would never be enough. For someone whose image was central to his profession, vitiligo was not just a medical condition. It became an emotional burden, a public burden, and a symbolic burden he never asked to carry. Vitiligo was only part of what Michael Jackson was dealing with. He was also diagnosed with discoid lupus, a form of lupus that primarily affects the skin. Discoid lupus can cause lesions, inflammation, scarring, and extreme photosensitivity. That last part matters enormously. Photosensitivity means sunlight can worsen the condition. Now think about that in combination with vitiligo. A person already losing pigment, which means losing part of the skin's natural protection against sunlight, is also dealing with a second autoimmune condition made worse by ultraviolet exposure. That changes how you interpret so many of Michael Jackson's public habits. The umbrellas, the hats, the masks, the gloves, the long sleeves, the effort to avoid direct sun. For years, these things were treated as proof of eccentricity, as symbols of oddness, as visual material for mockery. But medically, they make sense. They make perfect sense. A person with depigmented skin and lupus-related photosensitivity would be expected to protect their face and body from sunlight aggressively. What the world turned into late-night jokes may in fact have been practical adaptations to chronic illness. And that is the tragedy running through so much of Michael Jackson's life. Behaviors that could have inspired compassion were packaged as evidence of weirdness because people preferred ridicule to understanding. It was one of the most repeated stories about him. And it survived because it appealed to deeper anxieties about race, identity, fame, and self-image. It was a narrative people found irresistible because it reduced a complex medical reality into a scandal they felt they could understand in one sentence. But medicine told a different story. In cases of extensive vitiligo, some patients are treated with depigmenting agents to remove the remaining islands of normal pigment and create a more uniform appearance. One such medication is monobenzone, a prescription product used medically in severe widespread vitiligo. This point is critical. Monobenzone is not evidence that someone is casually bleaching themselves for fashion or fantasy. It is a recognized treatment option in advanced vitiligo cases, used when the disease has already depigmented large portions of the body and the remaining pigment creates severe unevenness. That distinction changes everything. If Michael Jackson used depigmenting treatment, that does not prove he was trying to become somebody else. It supports the far more likely medical explanation. He was trying to manage a real and progressive disease in the only ways available to him. The tabloids framed it as vanity. The medicine framed it as treatment. And then, after his death, the official record weighed in. Michael Jackson's autopsy documented depigmentation consistent with vitiligo. That matters because the coroner had no need to protect an image, defend a reputation, or participate in myth-making. The autopsy recorded what was physically there. And what was physically there confirmed what Michael had been saying for years. In the end, his own body testified on his behalf. There is another layer to this story, and it may be the most human of all. Autoimmune diseases are complicated. They are not caused by stress alone. But modern research increasingly recognizes that stress can influence immune function, trigger flares, and worsen symptoms in people who are already biologically vulnerable. And if there was ever a human being living under exceptional, relentless, identity-shaping stress, it was Michael Jackson. He did not just become famous, he became globally iconic at an age when most people are still learning who they are. He did not just perform. He performed with a perfectionism so intense that it consumed his energy, his privacy, and eventually his health. He did not just attract media attention. He lived inside a permanent storm of scrutiny, projection, accusation, demand, and expectation. Think about what that does to a nervous system. No ordinary privacy, no safe anonymity, no quiet walk outside, no mistake too small to escape public judgment, no physical change too personal to remain personal. A human body is not designed for that kind of sustained exposure. A body under chronic stress does not rest easily. Sleep is disrupted. Hormonal systems shift. Pain becomes harder to regulate. Immune responses can become more chaotic. What begins psychologically can become physiological. Michael Jackson's life was an extreme experiment in what happens when extraordinary talent is placed inside extraordinary pressure and then observed constantly by a world that mistakes access for ownership. His body carried that cost. Then there is the second meaning of DNA in Michael Jackson's story, not the disease inside the body, but the ancestry behind the family. For many African American families, genealogy is not a simple path backward. It is broken by slavery, renaming, erased records, forced separations, and silence. The family stories passed down through generations often contain fragments of truth, protective myths, substitutions, and unexplained gaps. In many cases, oral history exists where formal history was destroyed. Some later genealogical research involving Michael Jackson's paternal relatives suggested a more complex paternal line than family lore had long held. Accounts circulated for years about Native American ancestry in the family, but Y chromosome work discussed by genealogical researchers pointed instead toward a paternal line connected to Western European, specifically French ancestry, entering the family during the slavery era in the American South. That point must be handled carefully. This was not a direct DNA test on Michael Jackson himself, made public during his lifetime. It was a genealogical reconstruction through paternal relatives and historical records. But even as a genealogical case study, it reveals something deeply important. It reflects the history of America, a history in which black family lines were shaped not only by African ancestry, but also by the violence, coercion, and erasure of slavery. A history in which biological truth and family narrative do not always match because the original conditions were built on domination and silence. In that sense, the ancestry story does not make Michael Jackson unusual. It makes him profoundly American. His family history, like that of countless African American families, appears to carry traces of West African survival, forced displacement, slavery-era disruption, and European paternal lines introduced under unequal and painful conditions. So when people talk about Michael Jackson's DNA as if it contains some spectacular hidden scandal, the truth is both quieter and heavier than that. It contains history. It contains inheritance. It contains the record of a family moving through one of the harshest social systems in modern history, and still, somehow, producing beauty. Michael Jackson's biology did not stop being a public obsession with his skin. People speculated endlessly about his face, his health, his ancestry, and later, his children. Were his children biologically his? Why did they look the way they looked? What was true? What was hidden? These questions reveal something uncomfortable about celebrity culture. The public often behaves as though a famous person's body becomes common property, as though parentage, medical records, skin, illness, and family lineage all become open-source entertainment once someone reaches a certain level of fame. But biology is still personal, even when the person is famous. No public obsession changes that. Michael Jackson's children have lived their own lives under the shadow of those questions, and there is a basic ethical point that should not be forgotten. Not every question the public wants answered is a question the public is entitled to have answered. And this principle should have applied to Michael himself. His illness was real, whether strangers believed it or not. His ancestry was real, whether family stories matched it perfectly or not. His body was real, whether tabloids simplified it or not. The tragedy is that even when science clarified parts of the truth, many people still preferred the more sensational version. The world kept asking questions not because the evidence was absent, but because uncertainty was more entertaining than closure. By the final years of his life, Michael Jackson was no longer just carrying fame. He was carrying accumulated physical strain, chronic stress, insomnia, pain, medical treatment, and the burden of having spent his entire life under the gaze of millions. And that may be one of the saddest elements of his story. So much of the public conversation focused on how he looked, while so little attention was given to what he might have been enduring. What does it mean to live in a body you can no longer control in the way the world expects? What does it mean to become a symbol when you are still a person? What does it mean to be doubted about your own illness while the evidence sits in your skin every day? Michael Jackson's life raises those questions with unusual force because he was both superhuman in performance and painfully human in suffering. He could electrify a stadium with a turn of the head. He could silence a crowd with one pose. He could create art that crossed language, race, and geography. But he was still a man with cells, tissue, pain, vulnerability, exhaustion, and a body that did not ask permission from his fame before it began to fail him in visible ways. The world loved the myth of Michael Jackson. It was less interested in the human being. And maybe that is why the truth took so long to settle in. The truth was too human. Conclusion. When you strip away the rumors, what remains is not a scandal. It is something sadder, more complex, and more deserving of dignity. A boy from Gary, Indiana, turned into one of the greatest entertainers in history. A man whose gifts were so extraordinary that the world sometimes forgot he had a body at all. A patient with vitiligo and lupus, telling the truth about his own condition, while millions chose disbelief. A family story shaped by the long aftermath of slavery, memory, silence, and the difficult work of recovering history through science. A public figure whose face became a battlefield between medical reality and media fiction. Michael Jackson's DNA did not reveal some monstrous secret. It revealed what DNA so often reveals when people are brave enough to read it honestly. Inheritance, vulnerability, history, damage, survival. The biological truth of Michael Jackson is not that he was trying to erase himself. It is that his body was going through things that the world turned into a spectacle. It is that his appearance was not a confession of self-hatred, but evidence of disease. It is that his ancestry, like the ancestry of so many American families, was more complicated than oral history alone could preserve. It is that science, medicine, and documentation eventually confirmed what he had already said himself. And maybe that is the final lesson in all of this. The truth was never missing. The truth was spoken. The truth was documented. The truth was medically described. The truth was visible. What was missing was the willingness to believe it. Michael Jackson asked, in the clearest terms he could, to be understood not as a rumor, not as a cartoon, not as a tabloid invention, but as a human being. And all these years later, that may still be the most overdue act of honesty the world owes him. Not more mythology, no more gossip, not another recycled headline, just belief. Because in the end, science said what he had been saying all along. And the saddest part is that it took official records, doctors, and a coroner's report for so many people to finally accept what he had already told them with his own voice.